After Marcus Dutch Holloway died at age 72 in his isolated cabin, his will revealed he wasn't a failed cattle rancher, but Special Agent Marcus J. Holloway, a deep-cover FBI operative who had single-handedly taken down 3 major drug cartels, while living completely undetected in the small town of Cedar Falls, Wyoming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The revelation would shake this tight-knit community of 1,200 residents to its core and expose a story of sacrifice, deception, and heroism that no one saw coming. Dutch Holloway had been a fixture in Cedar Falls since 1988, arriving with nothing but a beat-up pickup truck and enough cash to buy the abandoned Riverside Ranch on the outskirts of town. For over 3 decades, he'd been the definition of a loner, a gruff, bearded man who kept to himself, rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone, and seemed to struggle just to keep his small cattle operation afloat. The townspeople had their theories about Dutch. Some said he was running from a bad divorce. Others whispered he'd lost his family in some tragic accident and came to Wyoming to escape the memories. A few believed he was just another drifter who'd found a place to disappear. What nobody suspected was that Marcus Holloway was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. The morning of March 15, 2024, changed everything. When Dutch failed to show up for his weekly supply run, something he'd done religiously every Thursday for 35 years, store owner Betty Martinez grew concerned. Dutch was nothing if not predictable. His absence sent ripples through the small business district of Cedar Falls. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man who'd known Dutch as well as anyone in town, which wasn't saying much, drove out to Riverside Ranch to check on the reclusive rancher. What he found would be the first domino in a chain of revelations that would rewrite everything. Cedar Falls thought it knew about the quiet man who'd lived among them for so long. Dutch Holloway was dead, apparently of natural causes, sitting peacefully in his favorite chair with a cup of coffee grown cold beside him. And it was what Sheriff Bradley discovered next that would turn this simple death into the most extraordinary story in Cedar Falls history. On the kitchen table, sealed in a manila envelope marked "Open immediately upon my death," was a document that would shatter every assumption the town had made about their mysterious neighbor. The first line read, "My name is Special Agent Marcus J. Holloway, badge number 4729, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have been operating under deep cover in Cedar Falls, Wyoming since October 1988. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're as shocked as we were when we first heard this story. Make sure to hit that subscribe button because what happens next will blow your mind. To understand the magnitude of what Sheriff Bradley had just discovered, you need to know what Cedar Falls was like in 1988. This wasn't just any small Wyoming town. It was a community that had been slowly dying. The coal mine that had sustained. The area for decades was shutting down. Young people were leaving for opportunities elsewhere, and the few remaining businesses were struggling to survive. When Dutch Holloway arrived that autumn with his weathered face and quiet demeanor, buying the old Riverside Ranch that had been abandoned for nearly 2 years, he seemed like just another lost soul seeking refuge in the middle of nowhere. The ranch itself was a modest operation, 800 acres of rolling grassland with a small 2-bedroom cabin, a barn that had seen better days, and grazing land that could support maybe 100 head of cattle at most. For a man supposedly trying to make a living as a rancher, it was barely adequate. But Dutch never seemed interested in expanding or improving the property. He ran a small herd, sold just enough cattle each year to get by, and lived so simply that people often wondered how he managed to pay his bills. What the residents of Cedar Falls didn't know was that Dutch's modest lifestyle was by design. Special Agent Marcus Holloway had been carefully crafted to appear unremarkable, forgettable, and just successful enough to avoid suspicion, but never successful enough to attract attention. Every detail of his cover had been meticulously planned by the FBI's Deep Cover Operations Unit. The real Marcus Holloway had grown up on a ranch in Nebraska, which gave him the authentic knowledge and mannerisms needed to convincingly play the role of a cattle rancher. He'd studied animal husbandry, learned to repair farm equipment, and could discuss cattle prices and weather patterns with the same natural ease as anyone who'd spent their life working the land. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior was a federal agent with an exceptional talent for observation and analysis. Dutch's daily routine had been the same for decades, and to the casual observer, it appeared to be the boring, repetitive life of a man who'd given up on ambition. He'd wake before dawn, tend to his cattle, fix whatever needed fixing around the ranch, and make his weekly trip to town for supplies. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't particularly warm either. He'd nod to people on the street, exchange brief pleasantries about the weather or cattle prices, and conduct his business with minimal conversation. At the Cedar Falls General Store, where Betty Martinez had worked for over 20 years, Dutch's Thursday routine was as predictable as sunrise. He'd arrive at exactly 2:30 p.m. buy the same basic supplies: coffee, canned goods, work clothes, and whatever parts he needed for equipment repairs. He'd pay in cash, accept his receipt with a quiet thank you, and drive back to his ranch. The entire transaction rarely took more than 15 minutes, and Dutch never lingered to chat or socialize. Betty had often wondered about Dutch's life. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, he remained an enigma. He never mentioned family, never talked about his past, and seemed to have no friends or regular visitors. Occasionally, she'd see him at Murphy's Diner, always sitting alone at the corner booth, reading a newspaper while he ate his meal in silence. He'd leave a modest tip and disappear back to his ranch, leaving no trace of his presence except the memory of a man who seemed to prefer his own company to that of others. The local diner, Murphy's, had been Dutch's one concession to social interaction. Owner Jack Murphy, a gregarious man who'd run the establishment for 30 years, had tried countless times to draw Dutch into conversation. He'd ask about the ranch, comment on the weather, or try to engage him in discussions about local politics or sports. Dutch would respond politely, but briefly, never offering more information than necessary and never asking questions in return. Dutch was the most mysterious regular customer I ever had, Jack would later tell reporters. He'd come in maybe once a week, always ordered the same thing: coffee black, meatloaf special if we had it, or the daily special if we didn't. He'd sit in that corner booth, read his paper, eat his food, and leave. I probably didn't exchange more than 100 words with the man total. What Jack didn't realize was that Dutch's choice of seating wasn't random. The corner booth provided a clear view of the entire diner, including the front door, the kitchen, and the parking lot outside. His newspaper reading wasn't casual entertainment. It was a cover for observation. While appearing to read about local events and sports scores, Dutch was actually monitoring the conversations around him, noting who came and went, and cataloging the social patterns of Cedar Falls. The town's younger residents barely noticed Dutch at all. To them, he was just another old rancher, part of the landscape like the weathered barns and rusty pickup trucks that dotted the countryside. High school students working part-time jobs at the grocery store or gas station would serve him with the polite disinterest reserved for elderly customers who never caused trouble, but never made much of an impression either. But some of the older residents had their suspicions about Dutch, though none came close to guessing the truth. Martha Henley, who'd lived in Cedar Falls her entire 78 years, had always found something odd about the mysterious rancher. She'd mentioned to her bridge club that Dutch never seemed to age quite like other men his age, that he moved with a kind of alertness that seemed unusual for someone supposedly broken down by decades of hard ranch work. There was something in his eyes, Martha would later recall. It's not unfriendly, but watchful. It's like he was always paying attention to things the rest of us missed. I used to joke that he looked like he was expecting trouble, but I never imagined he was actually watching for it. Dr. Sarah Chen, Cedar Falls' only physician, had treated Dutch on several occasions over the years, nothing serious, just routine checkups and minor injuries that were common among ranchers. She'd found him to be a remarkably healthy man. For his age, with the kind of physical condition that suggested a more active lifestyle than his sedentary reputation implied. His medical records showed no chronic conditions, no prescriptions for pain medication that would be expected from someone who'd spent decades doing physical ranch work, and a level of fitness that seemed inconsistent with his supposed lifestyle. He was one of the healthiest patients I had, Dr. Chen would later tell investigators. No arthritis, no back problems, excellent cardiovascular health. For a man supposedly in his 70s who'd been doing manual labor his entire life, he was in remarkably good shape. I always wondered about that, but he was private about his health history and never volunteered information about his past. The truth, as Sheriff Bradley was about to discover, was that Dutch Holloway had been maintaining the physical and mental conditioning of an active federal agent throughout his decades in Cedar Falls. His daily routine included rigorous exercise that he disguised as ranch work, combat training that he practiced in the remote areas of his property, constant mental exercises to maintain the observation and analysis, skills that made him such an effective undercover operative. When Dutch occasionally disappeared for days or weeks at a time, he'd explain these absences as visits to family or medical appointments in larger cities. The townspeople accepted these explanations without question. After all, everyone had family obligations and health concerns that required travel. What they didn't know was that these trips were actually operational assignments, meetings with FBI handlers, advanced training sessions, and coordination with other law enforcement agencies involved in the long-term investigations Dutch was conducting. The isolation of Riverside Ranch had been perfect for Dutch's real work. Located 7 miles from town on a dirt road that saw little traffic, the property provided the privacy he needed to conduct secure communications with FBI headquarters, analyze intelligence, and maintain the equipment necessary for his operations. The ranch's remote location also made it an ideal observation post for monitoring the activities that had originally brought the FBI to Cedar Falls in 1988. When Dutch first arrived, the Bureau had received intelligence suggesting that Cedar Falls was being used as a way station for drug trafficking operations, moving product from Mexico through the American Southwest toward major population centers in the north. The town's location at the intersection of several major highways, combined with its small size and limited law enforcement presence, made it an attractive stopping point for criminal organizations seeking to avoid detection. The FBI's initial plan had been to place an undercover agent in Cedar Falls for 6 months to a year, long enough to identify the local connections and gather evidence for prosecutions. But as Dutch began to understand the scope of the criminal activity in the area, it became clear that the operation was far more complex than initially suspected. What appeared to be a simple drug trafficking way station was actually a sophisticated network, involving multiple criminal organizations, corrupt local officials, and connections to major cartels operating throughout the western United States. Dutch's first major breakthrough came in 1991, 3 years after his arrival. While conducting routine surveillance under the cover of checking on strayed cattle, he discovered that the abandoned Copper Creek mine, located 15 miles north of Cedar Falls, was being used as a storage and distribution center for massive quantities of cocaine and heroin. The operation was run by the Morales Cartel, a Mexican organization that had established a network of safe houses and distribution points throughout the American Southwest. The discovery of the Copper Creek operation required Dutch to make a difficult decision. He could report the location to the FBI and request immediate action, which would likely result in arrests and the seizure of drugs, but would also expose his cover and end his. Or he could continue his surveillance, gathering intelligence about the organization's structure, personnel, and methods, while allowing the drug trafficking to continue in the short term. Dutch chose the longer path, a decision that would define the next decade of his life, working with his FBI handlers. He developed a strategy to systematically map the entire criminal network operating in the region. This required him to maintain his cover while conducting increasingly sophisticated surveillance operations, often putting himself in considerable danger as he documented the activities of violent criminals who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone they suspected of being a threat. The Morales Cartel operation was eventually dismantled in 1994, but not before Dutch had gathered enough intelligence to identify and prosecute over 40 members of the organization, including several high-ranking leaders who had previously been considered untouchable by law enforcement. The successful conclusion of this investigation earned Dutch commendations from FBI headquarters and established him as one of the Bureau's most effective deep-cover operatives. But Dutch's work in Cedar Falls was far from over. His success against the Morales cartel had created a power vacuum in the regional drug trade, and it wasn't long before other criminal organizations moved in to fill the gap. The Kla Bratva, a Russian organized crime group, established operations in the area in 1995, using Cedar Falls as a base for money laundering and human trafficking activities. Their methods were different from the Mexican cartels, more sophisticated, more violent, and more difficult to penetrate. Dutch's investigation of the Coslov operation required him to develop new skills and methods. The Russian criminals were more paranoid and security conscious than their Mexican predecessors, and they had experience dealing with law enforcement infiltration. Dutch had to become more than just an observer. He had to find ways to gain the trust of people who trusted no one, to become useful to an organization that eliminated anyone who might pose a threat. The breakthrough came when Dutch discovered that the Coslov organization needed legitimate businesses to launder money and provide cover for their operations. His struggling ranch operation and his reputation as a man who minded his own business made him an attractive potential partner. Over the course of several months, Dutch carefully positioned himself as someone who might be willing to provide services to the organization in exchange for financial compensation. This phase of the investigation was the most dangerous of Dutch's career. He was now directly interacting with violent criminals, attending meetings where any wrong word or suspicious behavior could result in his death. He had to maintain his cover while secretly documenting the organization's structure, recording conversations, and identifying key personnel. The stress of this double life was enormous, and Dutch later told his handlers that there were times when he wasn't sure he'd be able to maintain his sanity. The Coslov investigation culminated in 1999 with coordinated raids across 3 states that resulted in the arrest of over 60 members of the organization and the seizure of millions of dollars in assets. Dutch's testimony, given in closed session to protect his identity, was crucial in securing convictions against the organization's leadership. Once again, his work had dismantled a major criminal enterprise, but the personal cost was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. By 2000, Dutch had been living his double life for 12 years. He'd spent more time as Marcus Holloway, the reclusive rancher, than he had as Marcus Holloway, the FBI agent. The lines between his cover identity and his real self had become increasingly blurred, and he was beginning to question whether he'd ever be able to return to a normal life. His handlers at the FBI were concerned about his psychological state and suggested that he might want to consider concluding his assignment. But Dutch wasn't ready to leave Cedar Falls. He'd become attached to the community in ways that surprised him, and he'd identified signs of a new criminal organization beginning to establish operations in the area. The Santos Cartel, a Mexican group that had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, was moving into the region with more sophisticated methods and better security practices. Dutch convinced his superiors to allow him to continue his work, arguing that his deep cover was too valuable to abandon. The Santos investigation would prove to be Dutch's most complex and dangerous assignment. This organization was led by educated, technologically sophisticated criminals who understood the importance of operational security. They used encrypted communications, conducted extensive background checks on potential associates, and employed counter-surveillance techniques that made them extremely difficult to investigate using traditional law enforcement methods. Dutch's approach to the Santos organization required him to essentially become a criminal himself. He had to demonstrate that he could be trusted with increasingly sensitive information and responsibilities, which meant participating in activities that pushed the boundaries of what was legally permissible for an undercover agent. With the approval of his handlers and federal prosecutors, Dutch became involved in money laundering operations, provided false documentation services, and helped establish legitimate businesses that served as fronts for criminal activities. This phase of the investigation lasted nearly 8 years and required Dutch to travel extensively throughout the western United States, always maintaining his cover as a small-time rancher who was supplementing his income through questionable activities. He attended high-level meetings with cartel leadership, helped coordinate drug shipments, provided intelligence that was used to protect the organization from law enforcement attention. The psychological toll of this extended undercover work was severe. Dutch was essentially living as a criminal, while secretly working to destroy the organization he appeared to serve. He had to witness violence, participate in illegal activities, and maintain relationships with people he knew he would eventually betray. The stress of this double life led to periods of depression and anxiety that he had to carefully conceal from both his criminal associates and his law enforcement handlers. The Santos Investigation finally concluded in 2008 with what was described as one of the most successful organized crime prosecutions in FBI history. Over 200 individuals were arrested across multiple states. The organization's assets worth over $500 million were seized. Dutch's 10-year investigation had provided the evidence needed to dismantle not just the Santos Cartel, but also several affiliated organizations and corrupt officials who had been protecting their operations. Case Dutch's handlers strongly encouraged him to conclude his assignment and return to regular FBI duties. He'd been working undercover for 20 years, far longer than was typical or healthy for this type of assignment. But Dutch had become so deeply embedded in his cover identity that the prospect of returning to his former life seemed impossible. Cedar Falls had become his home, and Marcus Holloway, the rancher, had become as real to him as Marcus Holloway, the FBI agent. Dutch negotiated an arrangement with the Bureau that would allow him to remain in Cedar Falls as a deep cover asset available for special assignments while officially transitioning to a retirement status. This arrangement was highly unusual, but was approved given Dutch's exceptional service record and the valuable intelligence network he'd established in the region. He would continue to live as Marcus Holloway, the rancher, while serving as the FBI's eyes and ears in an area that had proven to be a consistent pathway for criminal organizations. The final phase of Dutch's career was spent in what he called maintenance mode, monitoring the region for new criminal activities while helping to train other undercover agents and providing intelligence support for investigations in neighboring areas. He continued to live modestly on his ranch, maintaining his cover while secretly serving as one of the FBI's most experienced and effective deep cover operatives. This period of Dutch's life was perhaps the most personally fulfilling. He'd found a way to serve his country while living in a place he'd grown to love, surrounded by people he'd come to care about even if they didn't know who he really was. He'd developed a genuine appreciation for the rhythms of ranch life, the beauty of the Wyoming landscape, and the simple pleasures of a life lived close to the land. As he entered his 70s, Dutch began to experience the health issues that come with age. His handlers at the FBI recognized that his active career was coming to an end, and they began making plans for his transition to full retirement. Dutch was awarded numerous commendations for his service, including the FBI's highest honor for undercover work, though these awards were classified and would not be revealed until after his death. In his final years, Dutch spent considerable time documenting his experiences and methods for future generations of agents. He wrote detailed reports on the challenges of long-term undercover work, the psychological pressures of maintaining a double identity, and the techniques he developed for conducting surveillance and intelligence gathering in rural environments. These documents would become essential training materials for FBI agents working in similar situations. Dutch also made careful preparations for his death. Knowing that his passing would inevitably lead to questions about his identity and background, he worked with FBI legal counsel to prepare his will and other documents that would reveal his true identity while protecting operational details that needed to remain classified. He wanted the people of Cedar Falls to know the truth about who he'd been while ensuring that his disclosure wouldn't compromise ongoing investigations or endanger other agents. The manila envelope that Sheriff Bradley found on Dutch's kitchen table contained not just the revelation of his FBI identity, but also instructions for contacting his handlers, a detailed account of his service record, and his wishes for how his death should be handled. Dutch had anticipated every aspect of his exposure and had prepared for it with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him such an effective agent. As Sheriff Bradley sat in Dutch's modest kitchen, staring at the document that would change Cedar Falls forever, he couldn't help but think about all the times he'd interacted with the man he'd known as a simple rancher. Every conversation, every brief encounter, every moment of casual interaction, took on new meaning in light of what he was reading. The quiet. A watchful man who'd lived among them for 35 years hadn't been what he seemed. He'd been something far more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The document in Sheriff Bradley's hands was just the beginning. Dutch's revelation would set in motion a chain of events that would transform Cedar Falls, expose the truth about decades of criminal activity in the region, and reveal the extraordinary story of a man who'd sacrificed everything in service to his country and his community. The most remarkable part of this story wasn't just that Dutch had lived among them undetected for so long. It was that he'd done so while conducting some of the most important law enforcement work of his generation. In the hours that followed, as Sheriff Bradley began making the phone calls that would bring FBI agents to Cedar Falls, he reflected on the magnitude of what Dutch had accomplished. This wasn't just a story about deception or hidden identity. It was a story about service, sacrifice, and the extraordinary lengths one man had gone to protect a community that never knew it needed protection. The revelation of Dutch Holloway's true identity would become one of the most remarkable stories in FBI history. A tale of dedication and sacrifice that would inspire future generations of agents while teaching the people of Cedar Falls that heroism often comes in the most unexpected forms. The quiet rancher who died alone in his cabin had actually been surrounded by the people he'd spent his life protecting, and his legacy would live on in the safety and security he'd provided to a community that would never forget the man who'd lived among them as their silent guardian. Sheriff Tom Bradley had seen his share of unusual situations in his 28 years of law enforcement, but nothing had prepared him for the document he was holding in Dutch Holloway's kitchen. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words. Again, Special Agent Marcus J. Holloway, badge number 4729, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The coffee cup beside Dutch's chair had grown cold hours ago, but the implications of what Bradley was reading would reverberate through Cedar Falls for years to come. Before we continue this incredible story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know what country or state you're watching from. And if you're as stunned by this revelation as the people of Cedar Falls were about to be, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what we're about to uncover gets even more unbelievable. To truly understand the earthquake that Dutch's revelation was about to cause in Cedar Falls, you need to understand what kind of community this was in 2024. Cedar Falls, Wyoming, population 1,247 according to the last census, was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where the biggest crime was usually teenage vandalism or the occasional bar fight on Saturday night.
Oh.
It was a town where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and where a stranger's presence was noticed and discussed within hours of their arrival. The town sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and distant mountains, connected to the outside world by Highway 287 and a network of country roads that hadn't been significantly updated since the 1960s. Main Street stretched for exactly 4 blocks and contained everything the town needed to function: Martinez General Store, Murphy's Diner, First National Bank of Cedar Falls, Miller's Hardware, Chen Medical Clinic, and a handful of other small businesses that had been serving the community for decades. Sheriff Bradley's office was located in the basement of the town hall, a modest brick building that also housed the mayor's office, the volunteer fire department, and the town's single holding cell that hadn't been used for anything more serious than housing drunk drivers overnight. Bradley ran the sheriff's department with the help of 2 part-time deputies, both local men who'd grown up in Cedar Falls, had never imagined they'd need to deal with anything more complicated than traffic violations and domestic disputes. The closest FBI field office was in Cheyenne, nearly 200 miles away, and in Bradley's entire career, he'd never had occasion to contact federal agents for assistance. Cedar Falls was the kind of place that handled its own problems, where disputes were settled over coffee at Murphy's Diner, and where the most serious law enforcement issues usually involve cattle theft or property line disputes between neighboring ranchers. Dutch Holloway's ranch, Riverside Ranch, sat on 800 acres 7 miles northeast of town, accessible by a dirt road that branched off from County Route 15. The property had been in the Jenkins family for 3 generations before they abandoned it in 1986, when the last of the Jenkins children moved to Denver for work. The ranch had sat empty for 2 years, slowly deteriorating. Before Dutch arrived with cash in hand and an apparent willingness to take on the challenge of bringing the property back to life. The ranch house itself was a modest 2-bedroom structure built in the 1940s, with a covered porch that faced west toward the mountains and a kitchen that looked out over the pastures where Dutch kept his small herd of cattle. The barn was solid, but weathered, large enough to house equipment and provide shelter for livestock during Wyoming's harsh winters. There was a workshop attached to the barn where Dutch maintained his equipment, and several smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. What made Riverside Ranch perfect for Dutch's real purposes was its isolation and its strategic location. The property sat at the intersection of several county roads that connected to major highways leading north toward Montana, south toward Colorado, and east toward Nebraska. From certain vantage points on the ranch, Dutch could observe traffic on these roads without being seen. The property's remote location provided the privacy he needed for secure communications with his FBI handlers. The ranch's previous owners, the Jenkins family, had left behind a reputation for being hardworking, honest people who'd struggled with the economic realities of small-scale ranching in an increasingly difficult market. When Dutch bought the property, the townspeople naturally assumed he was following in their footsteps another rancher trying to make a living from the land. It's probably destined for the same economic struggles that had driven out the Jenkins family. Dutch's first years in Cedar Falls had been carefully orchestrated to establish his cover identity. He'd made a point of introducing himself to key members of the community, attending the occasional town meeting, and conducting business in ways that would make him seem like a typical rancher. He'd bought supplies at Martinez's general store, eaten meals at Murphy's diner, and sought medical attention from Dr. Chen when he needed to establish a medical history for his cover identity. Betty Martinez, who'd owned the general store with her husband Carlos since 1975, remembered Dutch's first visit to their establishment in November 1988. He'd been polite but reserved, asking about the availability of ranch supplies and inquiring about local feed dealers. He'd paid for his purchases with cash, which wasn't unusual for ranchers who preferred to avoid credit whenever possible, and had asked practical questions about the local business community. He seemed like any other rancher starting out, Betty would later recall. Quiet, serious about his work, careful with his money. Carlos and I figured he was probably using savings or inheritance money to get started, which was pretty common back then. A lot of folks came to Wyoming thinking they could make a living ranching, and most of them learned pretty quickly how hard it really was. Dutch's interactions with Dr. Sarah Chen during his early years in Cedar Falls were particularly important for establishing his cover identity. He'd scheduled a routine physical examination within a month of his arrival, claiming he needed to establish care with a local physician. Dr. Chen had found him to be in excellent health for a man in his late 30s, though she'd noted that his hands were softer than she'd expect from someone who'd supposedly been doing ranch work his entire life. He told me he'd been working in ranch management before coming to Cedar Falls, Dr. Chen remembered. Said he'd been more of a desk job guy, but was looking forward to getting back to hands-on work. It explained why he was in such good shape, but didn't have the calluses and wear patterns you'd expect from someone who'd been doing physical labor for years. What Dr. Chen didn't know was that Dutch's excellent physical condition was the result of FBI training and conditioning, and that his ranch management background was a carefully constructed cover story designed to explain any inconsistencies in his knowledge or appearance. The FBI's cover development team had spent months creating a believable backstory for Dutch, complete with employment records, references, and personal history that would stand up to casual scrutiny. Dutch's financial situation in Cedar Falls appeared to be typical of a small-scale rancher operating on tight margins. He maintained a modest checking account at First National Bank of Cedar Falls, made regular deposits from cattle sales, and lived within the means that his ranch operation would realistically provide. Bank President Robert Walsh had reviewed Dutch's account applications when he first arrived and had found everything to be in order for a new resident establishing banking relationships. Dutch was a model customer from a banking perspective. Walsh would later tell investigators he maintained adequate balances, never overdrew his account, and conducted his business in a straightforward manner. His deposits and withdrawals were consistent with what you'd expect from a small ranching operation. Nothing flashy, nothing suspicious, just a man trying to make a living from the land. What Walsh didn't realize was that Dutch's modest lifestyle and careful financial management were part of his cover. The FBI was secretly supplementing his income through a complex system of payments that were disguised as ranch-related income. And Dutch was under strict instructions to live within the means that his cover identity would realistically provide. His handlers understood that any display of wealth or financial resources beyond what a struggling rancher could legitimately possess would draw unwanted attention and potentially compromise his cover. Dutch's social interactions in Cedar Falls were limited but consistent with his cover identity as a somewhat antisocial rancher who preferred his own company. He would occasionally attend town council meetings when issues affecting ranchers were being discussed, but he rarely spoke and never volunteered for committees or community activities. He was polite to his neighbors, but didn't seek out social relationships, and he declined invitations to community events like church socials or holiday celebrations. This social isolation was both necessary for maintaining his cover and personally difficult for Dutch. As an FBI agent, he'd been trained to build rapport and establish relationships as part of his investigative work. But his deep cover assignment required him to maintain distance from the very people he was protecting. He couldn't risk forming close friendships that might lead to questions about his background or activities that he couldn't honestly answer. The few close calls Dutch experienced during his early years in Cedar Falls demonstrated the challenges of maintaining a deep cover identity. In 1991, a former classmate from his actual high school in Nebraska visited Cedar Falls while traveling through Wyoming and happened to stop at Murphy's Diner while Dutch was eating lunch. The man didn't recognize Dutch immediately, but something about his appearance seemed familiar. Dutch managed to avoid direct interaction by leaving the diner quickly, but the incident reminded him of the constant vigilance required to maintain his cover. Another close call occurred in 1993 when a reporter from the regional newspaper visited Cedar Falls to write a feature story about small-town ranching. The reporter interviewed several local ranchers, including Dutch, and asked detailed questions about his background and experience. Dutch's responses were carefully crafted to be truthful but vague, and he managed to avoid providing specific details that could be verified. The resulting article mentioned Dutch only briefly, but the experience reinforced the importance of maintaining a low profile. Dutch's ranch operation was deliberately designed to appear marginally successful, profitable enough to sustain his presence in the community, but not so successful as to attract attention or questions about his methods. He maintained a herd of approximately 80 head of cattle, primarily Angus and Hereford breeds that were well suited to the local climate and market conditions. He sold cattle annually at the regional livestock auction in Cheyenne, and his prices and profits were consistent with what other small ranchers in the area were achieving. The ranch's infrastructure was adequate, but not impressive, Dutch maintained his equipment carefully but didn't invest in expensive upgrades or expansions that might suggest access to financial resources beyond what his ranch income would provide. His pickup truck was a reliable but aging Ford that he kept in good repair, and his farm equipment was older but functional. This careful balance between adequacy and modesty was essential for maintaining his cover over the long term. Dutch's daily routine on the ranch provided perfect cover for his real activities. He would wake before dawn and spend the morning hours tending to his cattle, checking fences, and maintaining equipment. All legitimate ranch activities that also provided opportunities for surveillance and observation. The remote location of his property meant that he could conduct secure communications with his FBI handlers without fear of observation. And the ranch's isolation made it an ideal base of operations for his intelligence-gathering activities. The workshop attached to Dutch's barn served a dual purpose that none of his neighbors suspected. While it appeared to be a typical ranch workshop containing tools and equipment for maintaining farm machinery, it also housed sophisticated surveillance and communication equipment that Dutch used for his FBI work. Hidden panels in the workshop, walls concealed recording devices, radio equipment, secure communication systems that allowed him to maintain contact with federal agents and analyze intelligence gathered during his operations. Dutch's ability to maintain this double life required extraordinary discipline and mental compartmentalization. During the day, he had to function as Marcus Holloway, the rancher, thinking and acting in ways consistent with that identity. During evening hours and on days when he was alone on the ranch, he would transition to his role as Special Agent Holloway, analyzing intelligence, planning operations, and coordinating with his handlers at the FBI. The psychological challenges of this double existence were significant and became more pronounced as the years passed. Dutch found himself sometimes struggling to remember which identity he was supposed to be maintaining in specific situations, and he occasionally caught himself responding to questions or situations in ways that were more consistent with his FBI training than his rancher cover. These lapses were rare and subtle, but they reminded him of the constant mental effort required to maintain his deception. Dutch's handlers at the FBI recognized the psychological pressures he was under and provided regular support through secure communications and periodic face-to-face meetings disguised as ranch business trips to larger cities. These sessions served multiple purposes. They allowed Dutch to receive new assignments and share intelligence. But they also provided opportunities for psychological evaluation and support to help him manage the stress of his double life. The years passed, and Dutch's investigations led to successful prosecutions of major criminal organizations. His value to the FBI became increasingly apparent. His unique position in Cedar Falls, his deep understanding of the regional criminal landscape, and his proven ability to maintain his cover under extreme pressure made him an irreplaceable asset in the Bureau's efforts to combat organized crime. In the American West, the success of Dutch's work was measured not just in arrests and convictions, but in the broader impact his investigations had on criminal activities in the region. His intelligence gathering and analysis helped the FBI understand how major criminal organizations used rural areas like Cedar Falls as part of their operations, and his methods became models for other deep cover operations in similar environments. By the late 1990s, Dutch had become something of a legend within certain circles of the FBI, though his identity remained classified and his work was known only to a small number of agents and supervisors with appropriate security clearances. His case studies were used to train other agents working deep cover assignments. His methodologies were incorporated into FBI training programs for rural and organized crime investigations. Dutch's personal sacrifices during this period were enormous. He had no close relationships, no family life, and no social connections beyond the superficial interactions required to maintain his cover. He watched the people of Cedar Falls live their lives, celebrate their milestones, and face their challenges, while he remained an observer rather than a participant. The loneliness and isolation were constant companions, and Dutch later told his handlers that there were times when he questioned whether the mission was worth the personal cost. But Dutch's commitment to his work never wavered. He understood that his sacrifices were protecting not just the people of Cedar Falls, but communities throughout the region from the violence and corruption that accompanied organized crime. His investigations had prevented countless crimes, saved lives, and disrupted criminal enterprises that would have caused immeasurable harm if left unchecked. The intelligence networks Dutch established during his years in Cedar Falls extended far beyond the boundaries of the small town. He developed relationships with informants and sources throughout Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, and Nebraska, creating a web of information gathering that provided the FBI with unprecedented insight into criminal activities across the American West. These networks remained active throughout his career and continued to provide valuable intelligence even after his primary investigations were completed. Dutch's expertise in rural law enforcement became increasingly valuable to the FBI's criminal organizations, adapted their methods to exploit the vulnerabilities of small towns and remote areas. His understanding of how these communities functioned, how information flowed within them, and how criminal activities could be detected and disrupted made him an essential resource for federal agents working similar cases throughout the country. The community of Cedar Falls, unaware of Dutch's true identity and activities, continued to function as it always had. People went about their daily lives, pursued their goals and dreams, and faced their challenges without knowing that one of their neighbors was working tirelessly to protect them from threats they never imagined. Dutch's success was measured partly by the fact that Cedar Falls remained the kind of place where people felt safe, where crime was rare, and where the most serious problems were usually personal rather than criminal. Dutch's ranch continued to operate as a legitimate business throughout his FBI career, though its primary purpose was always to provide cover for his real work. He took pride in the ranch operation and genuinely enjoyed many aspects of the ranching life, finding that the physical work and connection to the land provided a welcome respite from the psychological pressures of his undercover work. The ranch also served as a constant reminder of the life he was living and the community he was protecting. As Dutch entered his final years of active service with the FBI, he began to prepare for the eventual conclusion of his assignment and the revelation of his true identity. He understood that his death would inevitably lead to questions about his background and activities, and he wanted to ensure that his disclosure would honor his service while protecting ongoing operations and the safety of others who had worked with him. The document that Sheriff Bradley found in Dutch's kitchen was the culmination of years of careful planning and preparation. Dutch had worked with FBI legal counsel and his handlers to craft a revelation that would tell his story while protecting classified information and operational details that needed to remain secret. He wanted the people of Cedar Falls to understand who he had been and what he had sacrificed for them. But he also wanted to ensure that his disclosure wouldn't compromise the safety or effectiveness of other agents working similar assignments. Dutch's final years were spent largely in what he called maintenance mode, monitoring the region for new criminal activities while serving as a resource for other FBI operations. He continued to live as Marcus Holloway the rancher while secretly providing intelligence and analysis that helped federal agents throughout the region. His experience and expertise made him an invaluable asset even as his active fieldwork decreased. Due to his advancing age, the transition from active agent to elder statesman was both a relief and a source of melancholy for Dutch. He was grateful to step back from the most dangerous aspects of his work. I also struggled with the knowledge that his career of service was coming to an end. The ranch that had served as his cover for so many years had become his genuine home. The identity of Marcus Holloway had become as real to him as his original identity as an FBI agent. Dutch's preparation for his death included detailed instructions for his handlers on how to manage the revelation of his identity and the disposition of his ranch and personal effects. He wanted to ensure that his property would be put to good use and that his story serve as an inspiration for future generations of agents while honoring the community that had unknowingly supported his mission for so many years. As sheriff, Bradley sat in Dutch's kitchen, reading the document that would change Cedar Falls forever. He was looking at the culmination of one of the most remarkable careers in FBI history. The quiet rancher who had lived among them for 35 years had been protecting them from threats they never knew existed, conducting investigations that dismantled major criminal organizations, serving his country with a level of dedication and sacrifice that few could imagine. The revelation of Dutch's true identity would transform not just how the people of Cedar Falls understood their mysterious neighbor, but how they understood their own community and their place in the larger world. The quiet town, they thought, was isolated from serious crime, had actually been the base of operations for some of the most important law enforcement work of the past 3 decades. Sheriff Bradley knew that the phone calls he was about to make would bring federal agents to Cedar Falls and transform the sleepy community into the center of media attention and law enforcement activity. But more importantly, he knew that Dutch's story would become a lasting reminder of the dedication and sacrifice required to protect the innocent and maintain the rule of law in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. The document in Bradley's hands represented more than just the revelation of a secret identity. It was the final chapter in a story of service, sacrifice, and heroism that would inspire law enforcement officers and citizens alike for generations to come. Dutch Holloway had lived his entire adult life in service to others, protecting a community that never knew it needed protection. And his legacy would live on in the safety and security he had provided to the people of Cedar Falls and countless other communities throughout the American West. Sheriff Tom Bradley stared at the FBI badge number printed in Dutch's careful handwriting, his mind struggling to process what he was reading. The quiet afternoon in Cedar Falls was about to become the most extraordinary day in the town's 127-year history. As Bradley reached for his radio to call his dispatcher, he noticed his hands were shaking. Nothing in his law enforcement training had prepared him for discovering that a man he'd known for decades was actually a federal agent who'd been living under deep cover in their small community. The radio crackled to life as Bradley pressed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Bradley at the Holloway Ranch. I need you to contact the FBI field office in Cheyenne immediately. Tell them we have a situation involving a deceased federal agent and they need to send someone out here right away." Dispatcher Linda Morrison had worked for the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department for 15 years, and she'd never heard that tone of controlled urgency in Bradley's voice. "Sheriff, did you say federal agent? Are you sure about that?" Looked down at the document in his hands again, focusing on the official language and specific details that left no room for doubt. "I'm sure, Linda. And Linda, don't discuss this over the radio anymore. Use the landline for all communication about this matter. I'll explain when I get back to the office." What Sheriff Bradley didn't know was that Dutch's death had already triggered a series of protocols within the FBI that would bring federal agents to Cedar Falls within hours. When Dutch failed to make his weekly coded communication with his handlers 3 days earlier, the Bureau had begun monitoring the situation. Dutch's advanced age and declining health had led his supervisors to establish contingency plans for exactly this scenario. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had been Dutch's primary handler for the past 8 years, coordinating his activities from the FBI's Denver field office and serving as his main point of contact with federal headquarters. When Dutch's scheduled communication failed to occur on Monday, Torres had initiated a welfare check protocol that involved discreet monitoring of local emergency services communications in the Cedar Falls area. The moment Linda Morrison's call reached the Cheyenne field office, automated systems alerted Torres in Denver. Within minutes, she was coordinating with a team of agents who had been on standby for this exact situation. Dutch's death marked the end of one of the FBI's longest-running and most successful deep cover operations, and the Bureau was prepared to move quickly to secure his property and manage the revelation of his identity. Back at Riverside Ranch, Sheriff Bradley was conducting a careful examination of Dutch's home, looking for additional evidence or documentation that might help him understand the full scope of what he'd discovered. The living room appeared normal, comfortable, but modest furniture, a few books, magazines about ranching and agriculture. But Bradley was now looking at everything with new eyes, wondering what he'd missed during his previous visits to check on Dutch over the years. In the bedroom, Bradley found Dutch's FBI service weapons secured in a hidden safe behind what appeared to be a simple picture frame. The safe also contained additional identification documents, encrypted communication devices, and files that were clearly marked as classified government materials. Bradley was careful not to disturb these items, understanding that they would need to be handled by federal agents with appropriate clearances. The kitchen, where Dutch had spent his final moments, told the story of a man who'd lived simply but with purpose. Coffee maker was still warm, suggesting Dutch had died recently after preparing his morning coffee. A calendar on the refrigerator showed appointments for routine ranch maintenance and a note to call Denver scheduled for the day after his death. Likely his regular communication with Agent Torres. Sheriff Bradley noticed details that had seemed unremarkable during previous visits but now took on new significance. The ranch house had better security than typical for rural properties, high-quality locks, and a security system that seemed sophisticated for a simple rancher. The windows provided excellent sight lines in all directions, and Dutch's favorite chair was positioned to observe anyone approaching the property. As Bradley continued his examination, he found a second sealed envelope marked for local law enforcement only. Inside was a letter specifically addressed to him, written in Dutch's familiar handwriting. "Sheriff Bradley, if you're reading this, then you've discovered my real identity and the FBI has been notified. I want you to know that I've observed your work over the years and have great respect for your dedication to protecting this community. You're going to have a lot of questions, and federal agents will be arriving soon to provide answers. What I can tell you is that my presence in Cedar Falls was never about investigating local law enforcement or residents. You were all under my protection, not my surveillance." The work I did here helped dismantle criminal organizations that would have brought violence and corruption to this region. I hope that when the full story is told, you'll understand that everything I did was in service of keeping Cedar Falls the kind of place where good people can live safely. Special Agent Marcus J. Holloway reading Dutch's personal message. Bradley felt a complex mix of emotions. There was relief in knowing that he and his department hadn't been under investigation, but also a profound sense of having been kept in the dark about major criminal activities in his jurisdiction. The letter raised as many questions as it answered, and Bradley knew the next few hours would bring revelations that would change how he understood his role as the protector of Cedar Falls. Bradley's radio crackled again. "Sheriff, I've got Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI on the phone. She says she's been expecting this call and has a team en route to your location. She wants to speak with you directly." "Patch her through to my cell phone," Bradley replied, walking out onto Dutch's porch, where he could speak privately. The view from the porch encompassed the rolling hills and distant mountains that Dutch had called home for 35 years. And Bradley found himself wondering what the federal agent had really thought about this place during all those years of isolation and secrecy. Agent Torres's voice was professional, but carried an undertone of genuine sadness when Bradley's phone rang. "Sheriff Bradley, this is Special Agent Rebecca Torres. I understand you've discovered Agent Holloway's identity. First, let me express my condolences. Marcus was not just a colleague, but someone I considered a friend, despite the professional distance required by his assignment." "Agent Torres, I have to admit I'm completely out of my depth here," Bradley said. "I've known Dutch Agent Holloway for over 20 years, and I never suspected anything." "Sheriff, I understand your confusion, and I want to be as transparent as possible within the constraints of national security," Torres replied. "Agent Holloway was conducting one of the most important organized crime investigations in FBI history. His work in your area led to the dismantling of 3 major criminal enterprises and prevented countless crimes. He specifically requested that local law enforcement not be briefed on his activities because he believed the authenticity of his cover depended on genuine reactions from community members." Bradley absorbed this information while looking out over Dutch's ranch. "Agent Torres, there's something I need to ask. Were there really criminal organizations operating in our area? Because I have to tell you, Cedar Falls is about as quiet as a town can get." "That's exactly why Agent Holloway's work was so effective," Torres explained. "The criminal organizations he was investigating specifically chose rural areas like Cedar Falls because they believed local law enforcement wouldn't detect their activities. Marcus proved them wrong, but he did it in a way that protected your community from ever knowing the danger they were in." As Bradley ended his call with Agent Torres, he realized that Dutch's death was about to transform Cedar Falls from a quiet rural community into the center of intense federal investigation and media attention. The FBI team en route to his location would need to secure Dutch's property, analyze decades of intelligence materials, and begin the complex process of revealing the truth about one of their most successful undercover operations. Bradley decided to return to town to prepare his small department for what was about to unfold. As he drove the 7 miles back to Cedar Falls, he called his 2 part-time deputies and asked them to report to the office immediately. He also contacted Mayor Patricia Rodriguez and asked her to clear her schedule for an emergency meeting. The conversation he was about to have with the town's leadership would be unlike anything in Cedar Falls history. The Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department occupied a modest space in the basement of the town hall, consisting of Bradley's office, a small conference room, and the single holding cell that served the entire county. Deputy Mike Harrison, a 34-year-old local man who'd grown up on a ranch outside town, arrived first, followed by Deputy Janet Cole, a recent criminal justice graduate who'd moved to Cedar Falls 6 months earlier seeking small-town law enforcement experience. "Mike, Janet, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to understand that everything I'm saying is completely verified," Bradley began. "Dutch Holloway was an undercover FBI agent. He's been conducting federal investigations from his ranch for the past 35 years. Deputy Harrison's reaction was immediate and skeptical. "Sheriff, with all due respect, that's crazy. Dutch Holloway couldn't investigate his way out of a paper bag. The man barely talked to anyone and spent all his time alone on that ranch. Are you sure someone isn't pulling an elaborate prank? Bradley handed Harrison the FBI identification document he'd found at Dutch's ranch. I thought the same thing at first. This is real, Mike. I've spoken with his FBI handler, and federal agents are en route to Cedar Falls as we speak. Dutch's real name was Special Agent Marcus J. Holloway, and apparently he was one of the most successful undercover agents in FBI history. Deputy Cole, whose criminal justice training included coursework on federal law enforcement operations, immediately grasped the implications. Sheriff, if Agent Holloway was working organized crime cases, that means there were major criminal activities happening in our jurisdiction that we never detected. What kind of operations was he investigating? According to his FBI handler, he dismantled 3 major criminal enterprises operating in this region, Bradley replied. Drug cartels, organized crime groups, the works. And he did it all while appearing to be a struggling rancher who could barely keep his operation afloat. The conference room fell silent as the 3 law enforcement officers absorbed the magnitude of what they were learning. For years, they'd patrolled the same roads, responded to the same types of calls, and believed they understood the criminal landscape of their jurisdiction. The revelation that major federal investigations had been conducted without their knowledge challenged everything they thought they knew about their community and their effectiveness as law enforcement officers. Deputy Harrison broke the silence with a question that would haunt many Cedar Falls residents in the coming days. Sheriff, if Dutch was watching for criminal activity all these years, what does that say about our ability to protect this community? Were we completely blind to what was happening around us? Before Bradley could respond, his radio crackled with an urgent message from dispatcher Morrison. Sheriff, I've got multiple federal vehicles approaching the town limits from the east. They're requesting directions to the Holloway Ranch and asking for a law enforcement escort. Bradley looked out the basement window and could see black SUVs with government plates pulling into the town hall parking lot. The FBI had arrived in Cedar Falls, and with them came the beginning of a transformation that would affect every resident of the small community. Agent Rebecca Torres stepped out of the lead vehicle, followed by a team of 6 federal agents, who immediately began unloading equipment and establishing a command post in the town hall parking lot. Torres was a woman in her mid-40s with graying brown hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to managing complex operations. She moved with purpose toward the town hall entrance, clearly focused on the task ahead. Sheriff Bradley. Torres extended her hand as she entered the basement office. I'm Rebecca Torres. We spoke on the phone, says Agent Williams, our evidence. Response team leader and Agent Chen, who specializes in organized crime investigations. We're going to need your full cooperation as we secure Agent Holloway's property and begin processing 35 years of intelligence materials. Bradley shook hands with each agent, noting their professional demeanor and the obvious preparation they'd made for this situation. Agent Torres, my deputies and I are at your disposal. I have to ask, how long have you been planning for? This day? Agent Holloway's advanced age meant we've been preparing for this scenario for several years, Torres replied. His death triggers protocols for protecting classified information, notifying relevant agencies, and managing the disclosure of his identity. We've also prepared for the impact this revelation will have on your community. Agent Williams, a tall man with close-cropped hair and the methodical manner of a career investigator, spread a map of Cedar Falls across the conference table. Sheriff, we need to establish a security perimeter around the Holloway Ranch while we process the scene. We're also going to need to interview community members who had regular contact with Agent Holloway. Can you provide us with a list of those individuals? Bradley thought about the small number of people who'd interacted with Dutch on a regular basis. That's not going to be a long list. Dutch kept to himself. Maybe a dozen people had regular contact with him, store owners, the doctor, bank president, a few others. But Agent Torres, what are you going to tell these people? How do you explain 35 years of deception? That's one of the most challenging aspects of this situation, Torres admitted. Agent Holloway's cover identity was so complete that revealing his true identity will be traumatic for people who thought they knew him. We have psychologists on our team who specialize in helping communities cope with this type of revelation. As the FBI agents continued their briefing, Mayor Patricia Rodriguez arrived at the town hall, having received Bradley's urgent call about an emergency meeting. A woman in her early 60s who'd served as mayor for 12 years, Rodriguez had the practical experience of managing a small town, but no preparation for dealing with federal investigations and media attention. "Sheriff Bradley, what's this about an FBI situation?" Rodriguez asked as she entered the conference room. "I saw all the federal vehicles in the parking lot, and people are already starting to talk." Bradley introduced Mayor Rodriguez to the federal agents and provided a brief summary of Dutch's true identity. The mayor's reaction was similar to everyone else's initial disbelief, followed by growing comprehension of the implications for Cedar Falls. "Let me understand this correctly," Mayor Rodriguez said. "Dutch Holloway, who's lived quietly in our community for 35 years, was actually an FBI agent conducting major criminal investigations, and nobody in local government was informed of this." Agent Torres nodded. "Mayor Rodriguez, I understand your concern about not being briefed on Agent Holloway's activities. The decision to maintain complete operational security was made at the highest levels of the FBI and was essential for protecting both Agent Holloway and your community. If local officials had known his true identity, it would have created security risks that could have compromised the investigations and endangered lives." The mayor processed this information while considering the practical challenges facing Cedar Falls. "Agent Torres, what happens now? Are we going to be invaded by media? Are there ongoing security concerns? What do I tell the town council and the residents who are going to have questions?" "We've prepared for media attention and have protocols for managing information disclosure," Torres replied. "Our public affairs office will coordinate with local officials to ensure accurate information is released while protecting operational and details that remain classified. As for security concerns, Agent Holloway's death effectively ends the active investigations. But we'll maintain a presence here until we've secured all intelligence materials." Agent Chen, who'd been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up with a question that would prove crucial for understanding Dutch's impact on Cedar Falls. "Sheriff Bradley, in your experience, how would you characterize the crime rate and security situation in Cedar Falls compared to similar communities?" Bradley considered the question carefully. "I'd say we've been remarkably fortunate. In my 28 years in law enforcement here, we've had very little serious crime. Some property crimes, domestic disputes, the occasional DUI, but nothing involving organized criminal activity or violence. I always attributed it to the isolation and the character of our residents." "Sheriff, what you're describing is actually remarkable for a community located at the intersection of major transportation routes," Chen replied. "Based on our analysis, communities similar to Cedar Falls typically experience much higher rates of drug trafficking, property crime, and violence related to organized criminal activity. Agent Holloway's presence and activities may have provided a deterrent effect that protected your community without you realizing it." This revelation added another layer of complexity to the situation facing Cedar Falls. Not only had they been unknowingly living alongside an undercover federal agent, but that agent's work may have been directly responsible for the peace and safety they'd taken for granted for decades. Deputy Cole asked the question that was beginning to occur to everyone in the room. If Agent Holloway's work was protecting our community, what happens now that he's gone? Are we going to become vulnerable to the kind of criminal activity he was preventing? Agent Torres's response was measured, but honest. "That's a legitimate concern, Deputy Cole. Agent Holloway's intelligence networks and deterrent presence provided security benefits that extended beyond his active investigations. We're evaluating ongoing security needs for this region and will coordinate with local law enforcement to ensure appropriate protection measures remain in place." As the afternoon progressed, the FBI team established their command post and began the complex process of securing Dutch's ranch and processing decades of intelligence materials. News of the federal presence in Cedar Falls was spreading through the community with the speed that only small towns can achieve, and residents were beginning to gather in small groups to discuss what they'd observed and to speculate about what was happening. Betty Martinez closed her general store early and drove out to the ranch, Hoping to get information about what had happened to Dutch, she was stopped at a roadblock established by federal agents. Half a mile from the ranch entrance, and was politely but firmly turned away. The sight of federal agents controlling access to a property she'd known for decades drove home the reality that everything she thought she knew about Dutch Holloway had been wrong. Dr. Sarah Chen received a call from Agent Torres requesting a meeting to discuss Dutch's medical history and her observations about his health and behavior over the years. As she reviewed Dutch's medical files in preparation for the interview, she began to notice patterns and inconsistencies that made sense in light of his true identity. His exceptional health, his vague responses to questions about his medical history, his periodic, unexplained absences, details that had seemed merely curious now, appeared to be evidence of his carefully maintained cover. Walsh was contacted by federal investigators requesting access to Dutch's financial records as part of their investigation into his activities. As Walsh reviewed the accounts, he was struck by the meticulous nature of Dutch's financial management and the careful way he'd maintained the appearance of a modest ranch operation while clearly having access to resources beyond what his visible income would suggest. Throughout Cedar Falls, residents were beginning to question their memories and assumptions about the man they'd known as Dutch Holloway. Conversations at Murphy's Diner, the post office, and Miller's Hardware centered on trying to reconcile the quiet, isolated rancher they'd known with the revelation that he'd been a federal agent conducting major criminal investigations. As evening approached, Sheriff Bradley stood on the steps of the town hall, looking out over the community he'd sworn to protect and wondering how the revelation of Dutch's true identity would change Cedar Falls forever. The federal vehicles in the parking lot and the agents working late into the night represented the beginning of a new chapter in the town's history, one that would challenge every resident's understanding of their community, their security, and the hidden heroes who sometimes walk among us unrecognized. The quiet rancher who'd died alone in his cabin had actually spent his entire adult life surrounded by the people he'd been protecting. And his death marked not just the end of an extraordinary career, but the beginning of a reckoning with truths that would transform how Cedar Falls understood itself and its place in the larger world. Sheriff Bradley knew that tomorrow would bring new revelations, more questions, and the beginning of a process that would forever change how the people of Cedar Falls understood the meaning of service, sacrifice, and the price of keeping communities safe from threats they never knew existed. The morning of March 16, 2024, would be remembered as the day Cedar Falls learned that everything they thought they knew about their community had been wrong. As the sun rose over the Wyoming hills, FBI evidence response teams were already deep into their examination of Dutch Holloway's ranch, uncovering a sophisticated operation that had been hidden in plain sight for 35 years. Agent Rebecca Torres stood in what appeared to be Dutch's modest workshop, watching as her team carefully dismantled false walls and hidden compartments that revealed the true scope of Special Agent Marcus J. Holloway's extraordinary career. Behind a panel that looked like ordinary barn siding, agents discovered a climate-controlled room containing decades of surveillance equipment, encrypted communication devices, and intelligence files that documented some of the most significant organized crime investigations in FBI history. "Sheriff Bradley, I think you need to see this," Agent Torres called as she examined a wall covered with photographs, maps, and detailed organizational charts. The sheriff, who'd been observing the federal operation since dawn, stepped into the hidden room and found himself looking at evidence of criminal enterprises he'd never imagined existed in his jurisdiction. The walls displayed the fruits of Dutch's decades-long investigation, photographs of suspected criminals, surveillance images of clandestine meetings, maps showing drug trafficking routes that passed directly through Cedar Falls, and organizational charts detailing the structure of 3 major criminal enterprises that had operated in the region: the Morales Cartel, the Coslov Bratva, and the Santos Cartel names. That meant nothing to local law enforcement, but represented some of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the American West. "My God," Sheriff Bradley whispered as he examined a photograph showing a meeting between cartel leaders at what he recognized as the abandoned Copper Creek mine, just 15 miles from Cedar Falls. This meeting happened in my county and I had no idea. Agent Torres pointed to a date stamp on the photograph. September 15th, 1991. Agent Holloway took this photograph during his investigation of the Morales Cartel's regional operations. Single image led to arrests that dismantled a drug trafficking network worth over $200 million annually. As the evidence team continued their work, they uncovered layer after layer of Dutch's operations. A sophisticated radio communication system allowed him to monitor law enforcement frequencies across 3 states. High-powered cameras with telephoto lenses provided surveillance capabilities covering miles of rural highways. Computer equipment contained encrypted files with detailed intelligence on criminal organizations, their methods, and their personnel. Agent Williams, the evidence response team leader, was cataloging items that demonstrated the breadth of Dutch's activities. Agent Torres, we've found surveillance equipment worth over $500,000, communication gear that requires federal authorization to possess, and intelligence files that represent decades of fieldwork. This wasn't just a long-term undercover assignment. This was a complete intelligence operation. The discovery that stunned even experienced federal agents was Dutch's personal journal, found in a fireproof safe behind his bedroom closet. Unlike his official reports to the FBI, the journal contained his private thoughts, fears, and observations about the double life he'd lived for 35 years. Agent Torres began reading excerpts aloud to help Sheriff Bradley understand the man he'd known as a neighbor. October 12, 1988. Arrived in Cedar Falls today. The town is exactly what I expected. Isolated, quiet, the kind of place where people mind their own business. Perfect for what I need to do, but I'm already feeling the weight of the deception I'll have to maintain. These seem like good people, and lying to them about who I am feels wrong, even though I know it's necessary. Sheriff Bradley listened with growing amazement as Torres continued reading from different periods of Dutch's career. March 3, 1994. The Morales operation is finally concluded. 43 arrests. Major disruption of drug trafficking through the region. But I can't tell anyone here what we've accomplished. I have to pretend that nothing has changed while knowing that we've made this community safer than the residents will ever realize. July 18, 2001. Sheriff, Bradley stopped by the ranch today to check on me after I missed my supply run last week. He's a good man. It kills me that I can't tell him why I was really absent, that I was testifying in federal court against the Coslov leadership. He thinks I'm a struggling rancher when I'm actually helping to put some of the most dangerous criminals in America behind bars. The journal entries revealed the emotional toll of Dutch's assignment and his growing attachment to Cedar Falls despite the isolation required by his cover. December 25, 2010. Another Christmas alone? I can see the lights in town from my porch. Families gathering for the holidays. Sometimes I wonder if the sacrifice is worth it. But then I remember the drugs that aren't flowing through this community. The violence that hasn't touched these families. The corruption that never took root. Here because of the work we've done. As Agent Torres read from Dutch's private thoughts, Sheriff Bradley began to understand. Not just the scope of the federal agent's professional accomplishments, but the personal cost of his service. Dutch had lived among them for decades, protecting them while being unable to form genuine relationships or share his true self with anyone in the community. The technical capabilities discovered at Dutch's ranch amazed even experienced FBI agents. Agent Chen, examining the communication equipment, explained to Sheriff Bradley how sophisticated the operation had been. Agent Holloway had the ability to monitor criminal communications across multiple states, coordinate with federal agencies throughout the region, maintain secure contact with FBI headquarters in Washington. This equipment represents technology that most field offices don't have access to, hidden beneath the ranch house's foundation. Agents discovered a bunker that served as Dutch's primary operational center. The underground facility contained backup power systems, secure communication equipment, and storage for sensitive intelligence materials. The bunker was accessible through a concealed entrance in the barn and was completely invisible from above ground. This facility could have supported extended surveillance operations, emergency communications during natural disasters, and secure operations even if the ranch house was compromised, Agent Williams explained. Agent Holloway wasn't just living here, He was running a complete intelligence operation that could function independently of external support. The scale of Dutch's surveillance network became apparent as agents discovered hidden cameras and monitoring equipment positioned throughout the region, disguised as ranch equipment or natural features. These devices had provided Dutch with comprehensive coverage of major transportation routes, remote meeting locations, and areas favored by criminal organizations for their operations. Sheriff Bradley was particularly struck by the discovery of detailed files on local residents, businesses, and institutions. Dutch had maintained extensive records on everyone in Cedar Falls, not as subjects of investigation, but as part of his responsibility to protect the community. The files contained information about residents' backgrounds, family connections, business relationships, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by criminal organizations. Agent Holloway knew more about this community than anyone who's ever lived here, Sheriff Bradley observed, as he reviewed files that contained information he'd never known about longtime residents. He understood the social networks, the economic relationships, the informal power structures, everything that would be important for protecting the community from infiltration or corruption. Agent Torres found evidence of Dutch's most sensitive work in files, marked with the highest security classifications. Sheriff Bradley, what we're discovering here represents some of the most important organized crime intelligence gathered by the FBI in the past 30 years. Agent Holloway's work didn't just dismantle individual criminal enterprises, it provided the foundation for understanding how these organizations operate in rural America. The revelation that shocked federal investigators was the discovery of evidence suggesting that Dutch's presence in Cedar Falls had prevented multiple attempts by criminal organizations to establish permanent operations in the region. Files documented at least 7 separate instances where criminal groups had considered using Cedar Falls as a base of operations but had ultimately chosen other locations after encountering unexplained difficulties or security concerns. Agent Holloway wasn't just gathering intelligence on criminal activities, Agent Chen explained. He was actively disrupting criminal operations through subtle interference that made Cedar Falls appear to be an unsuitable location for illegal activities. The criminal organizations never realized they were being actively opposed. They just found that their plans consistently failed when they tried to operate in this area. The evidence team discovered communications equipment that revealed Dutch's role in coordinating with law enforcement agencies throughout the western United States. His intelligence had contributed to successful operations in Colorado, Montana, Nebraska, and Utah, making him one of the most valuable sources of information on rural organized crime in FBI history. Sheriff Bradley was overwhelmed by the scope of what he was learning. Agent Torres Dutch was living 7 miles from my office, and he was conducting operations that were more significant than anything my department has ever handled. How did he manage to keep all of this secret for so long? Operational security was Agent Holloway's greatest skill, Torres replied. He understood that the effectiveness of his work depended on absolute secrecy. Every aspect of his cover identity was designed to deflect attention and discourage curiosity. He deliberately cultivated a reputation as an antisocial, unsuccessful rancher specifically to avoid the kind of interest that might lead to questions about his background or activities. The personal cost of Dutch's commitment became evident. In his living quarters, his bedroom was spartanly furnished, with few personal possessions beyond the basic necessities. The absence of family photographs, personal mementos, or items that reflected hobbies or interests outside of his cover identity demonstrated the completeness of his sacrifice. Agent Torres found Dutch's most personal writings in a locked drawer of his desk. Sheriff Bradley, I think you should hear this entry from just last month, February 14th, 2024, Valentine's Day. Watch the young couples in town today. People my age celebrating anniversaries with their spouses, families gathering. For Sunday dinner, I've spent 35 years protecting this community's way of life while being unable to participate in it myself. I have no regrets about my service. But I wonder sometimes what kind of man I might have been if I'd chosen a different path. The evidence team's work revealed that Dutch had maintained detailed contingency plans for various scenarios, including his death, capture, or exposure. He'd prepared instructions for protecting ongoing operations, preserving intelligence materials, and ensuring that his revelation wouldn't compromise other agents or sources. His meticulous planning extended even to his funeral arrangements and the disposition of his property. Agent Holloway thought of everything, Agent Williams observed as he reviewed the comprehensive plans Dutch had prepared. He understood that his death would create security and public relations challenges for the Bureau, and he provided detailed guidance for managing every aspect of the transition from active operations to historical record. Sheriff Bradley discovered that Dutch had been aware of his activities and had actually provided discreet assistance to local law enforcement on several occasions. Files contained references to anonymous tips that had helped solve local crimes, information that had prevented accidents or emergencies, and subtle guidance that had improved the effectiveness of the sheriff's department. Without revealing the source of the assistance, there were times over the years when we received anonymous tips that led to arrests or helped us prevent problems, Bradley realized. I always wondered where that information came from. Now I know it was Dutch, helping us do our jobs better. While maintaining his cover, the technical analysis of Dutch's equipment revealed capabilities that exceeded what most FBI field offices possessed. His communication systems could intercept and decrypt criminal communications. His surveillance equipment could monitor activities across vast distances, and his analytical capabilities allowed him to process intelligence and identify patterns that less sophisticated operations would miss. Agent Chen was particularly impressed by Dutch's analytical work. Agent Holloway didn't just collect information, he analyzed it, synthesized it, and turned raw intelligence into actionable insights that led to successful prosecutions. His reports demonstrate a level of analytical sophistication that's rare even among experienced federal agents. The discovery of Dutch's training materials revealed his role in developing FBI methods for rural undercover operations. He'd written manuals on maintaining long-term cover identities, conducting surveillance in rural environments, and building intelligence networks in small communities. His work had become the foundation for training other agents assigned to similar operations. Agent Holloway essentially created the playbook for rural undercover operations, Agent Torres explained. His methods are now taught at the FBI Academy and have been used by agents throughout the country. His influence on federal law enforcement extends far beyond his own investigations. The evidence team found records of Dutch's coordination with international law enforcement agencies, demonstrating that his work had global implications. His intelligence on Mexican cartels had been shared with Mexican authorities. His information on Russian organized crime had been provided to European law enforcement agencies, and his analysis of trafficking routes had contributed to operations on multiple continents. Sheriff Bradley was struck by the contrast between Dutch's public persona and his actual capabilities. Agent Torres, the man I knew, could barely manage a conversation about the weather. Now I'm learning that he was coordinating with law enforcement agencies around the world and conducting operations that influenced international criminal investigations. That contrast was deliberate and essential for his success, Torres replied. Agent Holloway understood that his effectiveness depended on being completely underestimated by everyone around him. His public persona as a struggling, antisocial rancher was carefully crafted to ensure that no one would suspect his true capabilities or activities. The evidence team's work revealed that Dutch's ranch had served as a safe house for witnesses and other agents on several occasions. Hidden rooms and escape routes had been built into the property's design, and the remote location provided security for sensitive meetings and operations. The ranch had been a hub of federal law enforcement activity while appearing to be nothing more than a modest cattle operation. Holloway Ranch was actually one of the most important federal law enforcement facilities in the western United States, Agent Williams observed. It provided capabilities that formal FBI offices couldn't offer because of their visibility and security limitations. As the day progressed, the scope of Dutch's accomplishments became increasingly clear. His work had resulted in over 300 arrests, the seizure of hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal assets, and the disruption of criminal networks that had operated across multiple states. His intelligence had prevented countless crimes and had made communities throughout the region safer than their residents ever realized. Agent Torres summarized the magnitude of Dutch's career as she briefed Sheriff Bradley on the preliminary findings. Sheriff Agent Holloway's work represents one of the most successful long-term undercover operations in FBI history. His investigations dismantled major criminal enterprises. His intelligence contributed to operations throughout the country, and his methods revolutionized how federal agents work in rural environments. The personal sacrifice required for Dutch's success was evident in every aspect of his life. He'd given up the possibility of marriage, family, normal friendships, and community involvement to maintain his cover and protect his mission. His dedication to his work had been absolute, and the cost had been the conventional markers of a fulfilling personal life. Agent Holloway chose to sacrifice his personal happiness for the safety of people who would never know his name or understand what he'd given up for them, Torres reflected. That level of selfless service is rare in any profession, but it's especially remarkable when it extends over 35 years. Sheriff Bradley found himself grappling with complex emotions as he absorbed the revelations about Dutch's true identity. There was admiration for the federal agent's extraordinary service, but also a sense of having been kept in the dark about major events in his own jurisdiction. The discovery challenged his understanding of his effectiveness as a law enforcement officer and his knowledge of his own community. Agent Torres, I have to ask, was my department really protecting this community, or were we just going through the motions while Dutch did the real work? Bradley asked. Sheriff Bradley, your work was essential for maintaining the normalcy that made Agent Holloway's cover possible, Torres replied. His success depended on Cedar Falls functioning as a typical small town with effective local law enforcement. You weren't irrelevant to community safety. You were an essential part of the environment that allowed Agent Holloway to operate effectively. The evidence team's work continued into the evening, with each new discovery adding to the remarkable story of Dutch Holloway's career. The quiet rancher who'd lived alone on the outskirts of Cedar Falls had actually been conducting some of the most important law enforcement work of his generation, protecting not just his immediate community, but communities throughout the American West. As Sheriff Bradley prepared to leave the ranch that evening, he took one last look at the property. That had been Dutch's home and operational base for 35 years. The modest buildings and peaceful setting gave no hint of the extraordinary activities that had been conducted there. The dangerous criminals who'd been investigated, or the countless lives that had been protected by the work of one dedicated federal agent. The revelation of Dutch's true identity would transform Cedar Falls in ways that were only beginning to become apparent. The community that had thought itself isolated from serious crime had actually been the center of major federal law enforcement operations. The residents who'd considered Dutch Holloway quiet failure had actually been living under the protection of one of the FBI's most successful agents. Tomorrow would bring new revelations as the evidence team continued their work and as the people of Cedar Falls began to understand the full scope of what Dutch had accomplished. The man who died alone in his cabin had actually spent his life surrounded by the people he'd dedicated himself to protecting. And his legacy would forever change how Cedar Falls understood the meaning of service, sacrifice, and heroism. 3 months after Dutch Holloway's death, Cedar Falls had transformed from a quiet Wyoming ranching community into a symbol of hidden heroism and selfless service that captured the attention of the entire nation. The FBI's revelation of Special Agent Marcus J. Holloway's extraordinary 35-year undercover operation had sparked conversations across America about the nature of true heroism and the sacrifices made by those who protect us from shadows. The town that had once been known only to locals and passing travelers now found itself featured on national news programs, in documentary films, and in textbooks about modern law enforcement. But for the 1,247 residents of Cedar Falls, the media attention was secondary to a deeper transformation in how they understood their community, their security, and the quiet man who had lived among them as their unrecognized guardian. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood in the newly established Marcus J. Holloway Memorial Park, built on a hill overlooking the town where Dutch used to sit on summer evenings, watching over the community he'd sworn to protect. The park featured a simple granite monument engraved with Dutch's service record and a quote from his personal journal: "True service requires no audience, seeks no recognition, finds its reward in the safety of those who never know they were protected. The memorial had become a pilgrimage site for law enforcement officers from across the country. But it held special meaning for the people of Cedar Falls, who came to understand that they had been living under the protection of an extraordinary individual for most of their lives. Betty Martinez visited the memorial every Thursday afternoon, the same day Dutch had made his weekly supply runs to her store for 35 years. "I keep thinking about all those Thursdays," Betty told visitors who came to hear first-hand accounts of Dutch's life in Cedar Falls. He'd come in, buy his supplies, exchange a few words about the weather, and leave. "I thought he was just another struggling rancher, maybe a little antisocial, definitely keeping to himself. Now I know he was protecting our entire community while we went about our daily lives completely unaware of the dangers he was watching for." The revelation of Dutch's true identity had prompted every resident of Cedar Falls to re-examine their memories and interactions with the man they'd known as a quiet neighbor, Dr. Sarah. Chen had spent weeks reviewing Dutch's medical records and her personal observations. Finally understanding the subtle signs that had pointed to his true identity, his physical condition was always remarkable for his supposed age and lifestyle. Dr. Chen reflected during an interview with a national news crew: "No chronic pain, excellent cardiovascular health, reflexes and awareness that seemed inconsistent with someone who'd supposedly spent decades doing hard ranch work. I attributed it to good genetics and an active lifestyle, but now I understand it was the result of federal agent training and conditioning." The Cedar Falls General Store had become an unofficial museum of Dutch's life, with Betty Martinez displaying photographs and newspaper clippings about his FBI career alongside the simple receipts from his weekly purchases. Visitors from around the country would stop to see the store, where a legendary federal agent had conducted the routine business of maintaining his cover identity. "People want to understand how someone could live such an extraordinary double life," Betty explained. "They look at these receipts for coffee, work clothes, and basic supplies, and they try to imagine the man who bought these ordinary things while secretly conducting some of the most important law enforcement work in the country." Murphy's Diner had experienced a similar transformation, with owner Jack Murphy fielding constant requests from visitors who wanted to sit in Dutch's corner booth and hear stories about the federal agent who'd eaten meals there in silence for decades. The booth had been preserved exactly as Dutch had left it, with a small plaque commemorating his service. Dutch would come in, order the same things, sit in that corner booth reading his newspaper, and leave without much conversation. Jack would tell visitors, "I always thought he was just a man who preferred his own company. I understand he was positioned to observe everyone who came and went, monitoring our community for threats while appearing to be just another customer." The economic impact of Dutch's story on Cedar Falls had been unexpected, but significant. The small town found itself hosting thousands of visitors each year, from law enforcement professionals seeking to understand Dutch's methods to families drawn by his story of service and sacrifice. Local businesses had expanded to accommodate the increased tourism, and several new establishments had opened to serve the steady stream of visitors. Mayor Patricia Rodriguez had worked with the FBI and the state of Wyoming to establish the Marcus J. Holloway Center for Rural Law Enforcement at the site of Dutch's ranch. The center would train federal agents in the specialized skills needed for rural undercover operations, ensuring that Dutch's pioneering methods would continue to protect communities across America. Agent Holloway's legacy isn't just about what he accomplished during his lifetime, Mayor Rodriguez explained during the center's dedication ceremony. It's about the ongoing protection his methods will provide to rural communities that face the same vulnerabilities Cedar Falls faced when criminal organizations tried to establish operations here. The FBI had declassified portions of Dutch's case files, revealing the scope of his investigations and their impact on organized crime throughout the western United States. The Morales Cartel, dismantled in 1994 through Dutch's intelligence, had been responsible for distributing over $200 million worth of illegal drugs annually. The Coslov Bratva, taken down in 1999, had operated money laundering and human trafficking networks across multiple states. The Santos Cartel, destroyed in 2008, had been among the most sophisticated criminal organizations in North American history. Agent Rebecca Torres, who had served as Dutch's handler for the final 8 years of his career, had become the public face of the FBI's efforts to honor his legacy. She spoke at law enforcement conferences around the country, sharing Dutch's story and the lessons his work provided for modern federal agents. Agent Holloway demonstrated that effective law enforcement requires more than tactics and technology. Torres would tell audiences of police officers, federal agents, and community leaders, it requires understanding the communities you're protecting, integrating yourself into their social fabric, and maintaining that protection even when no one knows you're providing it. His work saved countless lives and prevented immeasurable harm. But his greatest achievement was doing it all while allowing the people he protected to live normal, peaceful lives. The psychological impact of Dutch's revelation on Cedar Falls residents had been profound and varied. Some felt grateful for his protection, others felt deceived by his deception, and many struggled with complex emotions about having unknowingly lived alongside such an extraordinary individual. The FBI had provided counseling services to help community members process their feelings about Dutch's double life. Clara Jennings, an elderly woman who had lived across the valley from Dutch's ranch, became one of the most vocal advocates for understanding and appreciating his sacrifice. At 81 years old, she had the perspective to appreciate the rarity of Dutch's dedication and the magnitude of what he had given up for their community. Some people feel angry that Dutch deceived us about who he was, Clara would tell visitors, but I see it differently. That man spent 35 years of his life protecting people who never knew they needed protection. He gave up marriage, family, friendships, and community involvement so that we could have all those things safely. That's not deception, that's sacrifice. The national media attention focused on Dutch's story had sparked broader conversations about the nature of heroism in modern America. Editorial writers, television commentators, and social media influencers debated whether Dutch's approach represented an ideal of selfless service or an outdated model of individual sacrifice. The discussions revealed deep cultural divisions about privacy, government surveillance, and the balance between security and transparency. But in Cedar Falls, the abstract debates about surveillance and privacy seemed irrelevant compared to the concrete reality of what Dutch had accomplished. Crime statistics revealed that during Dutch's 35 years in the community, Cedar Falls had experienced significantly lower rates of drug-related crime, property crime, and violent crime compared to similar communities throughout the region. Sheriff Bradley had become an unofficial spokesman for the community's perspective on Dutch's legacy. His department had cooperated fully with federal investigators, and his insights into Dutch's methods had contributed to the FBI's understanding of rural law enforcement challenges. Dutch wasn't spying on us, Bradley would explain to reporters and visitors. He's protecting us. There's a big difference between surveillance for the purpose of control and observation for the purpose of protection. Dutch was watching for external threats, not monitoring our personal lives or political activities. The transformation of Riverside Ranch into the Holloway Center had preserved Dutch's home as a living museum while converting the rest of the property into a training facility for federal agents. Visitors could tour the modest ranch house where Dutch had lived, see the hidden operational center where he had conducted his intelligence work, and learn about the methods he had developed for rural undercover operations. The center's first class of trainees included agents from the FBI, DATF, and state police agencies from across the country. Their curriculum included not just the technical aspects of undercover work, but also the psychological preparation needed for long-term assignments and the ethical considerations involved in deceiving communities for their own protection. Agent Jennifer Martinez, a young FBI agent who was part of the center's inaugural class, found Dutch's story both inspiring and daunting. Learning about Agent Holloway's work makes you realize how much personal sacrifice can be required for public service, she reflected. He gave up everything that most people consider essential for a fulfilling life: relationships, family, community involvement, so that other people could have those things safely. The academic study of Dutch's methods had attracted researchers from universities across the country who were interested in understanding the psychological, sociological, and operational aspects of his work. His ability to maintain his cover identity for 35 years while conducting complex investigations represented a unique case study in human psychology and law enforcement methodology. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a professor of criminology at the University of Wyoming, had been granted access to Dutch's declassified files for her research into rural organized crime. Her preliminary findings suggested that Dutch's approach could serve as a model for protecting other rural communities from criminal infiltration. Agent Holloway's work demonstrates that rural communities are not inherently safer than urban areas. They're simply protected by different methods, Dr. Warren explained. His presence in Cedar Falls created a deterrent effect that prevented criminal organizations from establishing operations there. Without that protection, the community would have been vulnerable to the same criminal activities that have plagued other rural areas. International attention focused on Dutch's story had led to inquiries from law enforcement agencies in other countries seeking to understand his methods and their potential application to different cultural and geographic contexts. The FBI had received requests for training and consultation from agencies in Canada, Australia, and several European countries facing similar challenges with organized crime in rural areas. The personal cost of Dutch's service had become a central theme in discussions about his legacy. His journal entries, carefully selected and released by the FBI, revealed a man who had struggled with loneliness, isolation, and the constant psychological pressure of maintaining his double identity. His writings showed that he had understood the price of his service, but had chosen to pay it willingly for the greater good. One journal entry from December 2015 had become particularly widely quoted. "Watch the Christmas pageant at the school. Tonight, from my truck parked across the street, saw families gathered together, children performing for their parents, a community celebrating together. I can never be part of that world, but knowing that my work helps preserve it makes the isolation bearable. True service sometimes requires standing apart from what you're protecting." The theological implications of Dutch's sacrifice had not been lost on religious leaders in Cedar Falls and beyond. Reverend Michael Thompson of the Cedar Falls Community Church had delivered several sermons about Dutch's life, drawing parallels between his hidden service and biblical teachings about selfless love and sacrifice. Agent Holloway embodied the principle that the greatest love is laying down your life for others. Reverend Thompson preached to congregations that now included visitors from around the country. He didn't die in a moment of heroic action. He lived a lifetime of heroic service, day after day, year after year, with no recognition and no reward except the knowledge that he was protecting people who would never know his name. The educational impact of Dutch's story had been equally significant. Schools across the country had incorporated his story into curricula about citizenship, service, and moral courage. Students wrote essays about his sacrifice, debated the ethical implications of his deception, and considered what his example meant for their own understanding of heroism and public service. High school senior Amanda Miller from Cedar Falls had won a national essay contest with her reflection on growing up in a community protected by Dutch's hidden service. Her essay, titled "The Guardian We Never Knew," had been read at the dedication ceremony for the Holloway Center and had been reprinted in newspapers across the country. "I grew up feeling safe in Cedar Falls, never knowing that my safety was being protected by someone who sacrificed his own happiness for mine," Amanda wrote. Agent Holloway's story teaches us that true heroes don't wear capes or seek recognition. They quietly do what needs to be done, even when no one is watching, and no one will ever thank them. The cultural impact of Dutch's story had extended beyond law enforcement and into popular culture. His life had inspired books, documentaries, and film projects that explored themes of service, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes who protect society from dangers most people never imagine. The challenge for artists and writers was capturing the quiet heroism of his daily life rather than sensationalizing the dramatic aspects of his investigations. Documentary filmmaker Chen had spent 6 months in Cedar Falls interviewing residents and federal agents for her film, The Quiet Guardian, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was later broadcast on national television. Her film focused not on the details of Dutch's investigations, but on the human cost of his service and the impact of his revelation on the community he had protected. Agent Holloway's story challenges our cultural assumptions about heroism, Chen explained during interviews about her film. We're conditioned to think of heroes as people who perform dramatic acts of courage in moments of crisis. But Dutch's heroism was in the quiet persistence of his service, the daily choice to continue. His mission even when it meant giving up everything that makes life personally fulfilling. The philosophical questions raised by Dutch's life had generated extensive academic discussion about the nature of moral obligation, the limits of personal sacrifice, and the relationship between individual fulfillment and public service. Ethicists debated whether Dutch's level of self-sacrifice represented an admirable ideal or an unsustainable extreme that no society should expect from its protectors. Professor James Anderson of the Harvard Kennedy School had written extensively about the implications of Dutch's service for modern democratic societies. Agent Holloway's career raises fundamental questions about how much we can ask of those who serve the public good, Anderson wrote. His willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for community safety was extraordinary. But it also highlights the tension between individual rights and collective security that defines modern governance. The practical applications of Dutch's methods had become a focus of law enforcement training programs across the country. The FBI had incorporated his techniques into curricula for rural assignments, and state police agencies had adapted his community integration strategies for their own operations. His approach to building intelligence networks and maintaining operational security had become standard training material for federal agents. Deputy Sheriff Janet Cole, who had been present when Dutch's identity was first revealed, had gone on to complete FBI training and had been assigned to rural organized crime investigations. Her experience in Cedar Falls and her understanding of Dutch's methods had made her a valuable asset in federal law enforcement's efforts to protect other rural communities. Agent Holloway's example showed us that effective law enforcement requires more than just responding to crimes after they happen, Cole explained during a training session for new agents. Real protection means understanding your community so thoroughly that you can identify and neutralize threats before they materialize. That requires the kind of long-term commitment and community integration that Agent Holloway demonstrated. The memorial services held for Dutch had drawn law enforcement officers from across the country, federal officials from Washington, and thousands of ordinary citizens who had been moved by his story. But the most meaningful tribute had come from the people of Cedar Falls, who had gathered to honor the man they had finally come to know as their guardian and protector. Betty Martinez had spoken at the memorial on behalf of the community, her words capturing the complex emotions of people who had discovered that a neighbor they had barely known had dedicated his life to their protection. Dutch Holloway lived among us for 35 years, and we thought we knew him, she said. We thought he was just another rancher struggling to make a living from the land. Now we know he was so much more. He was our protector, our guardian, our hero. We never got the chance to thank him while he was alive, but we can honor his memory by understanding what he sacrificed for us. The lasting impact of Dutch's revelation on Cedar Falls had been profound and positive. The community had gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity of modern security challenges and the dedication required to address them. Residents had developed a greater sense of gratitude for the law enforcement officers who protect them and a better understanding of the personal costs of public service. The town's children, who had grown up hearing stories about Agent Holloway's service, had developed a sophisticated understanding of heroism that went beyond popular culture stereotypes. They understood that real heroes often worked in silence, that true courage was demonstrated through persistent service rather than dramatic gestures, and that the most important protection often came from people they would never know or recognize. As Sheriff Bradley reflected on the changes Dutch's revelation had brought to Cedar Falls, he recognized that the community had been transformed in ways that went far beyond increased tourism or media attention. The people of Cedar Falls had learned that they had been living under the protection of an extraordinary individual, and that knowledge had changed how they understood their own responsibilities to each other and their community. Dutch's story teaches us that we all have a responsibility to watch out for each other, Bradley observed. We may not all be federal agents conducting undercover investigations, but we can all be aware of our surroundings, protective of our neighbors, committed to maintaining the kind of community that Dutch spent his life defending. The legacy of Special Agent Marcus J. Holloway had become a permanent part of American law enforcement history and a lasting reminder of the dedication required to protect communities from threats they may never see or understand. His story had shown that true heroism often worked in silence, that the greatest service was often unrecognized, and that the most profound love was sometimes expressed through sacrifice that would never be acknowledged or appreciated by those it protected. In the end, Dutch Holloway's life had demonstrated that the highest form of service was protecting others' ability to live normal, peaceful lives without knowing they needed protection. His 35 years in Cedar Falls had been a masterpiece of selfless dedication, and his legacy would continue to inspire law enforcement officers and ordinary citizens for generations to come. The quiet rancher who had died alone in his cabin had actually been surrounded by the community he had spent his life protecting, and his story had become a testament to the hidden heroes who stand guard in the shadows, asking for nothing except the knowledge that their service makes the world a safer place for others. As the sun set over the Wyoming hills that Dutch had called home for 35 years, the lights of Cedar Falls began to twinkle in the valley below, a community that would forever remember the man who had protected them from the darkness they never knew existed, and who had given them the greatest gift of all, the freedom to live their lives in peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.